Most coaches I speak to describe burnout in the same way. They're talking about exhaustion, overwhelm, someone who's lost their drive. And they're not wrong, but they're also describing the symptoms, not what's actually happening. Because burnout isn't a motivation problem, it's not a time management problem, and it definitely is not a resilience problem. Burnout is a neurochemical event, right? It's your brain, your actual biology responding to an environment it was never built to survive long term. And until you understand that as a coach, you can't fully help the people sitting across from you who are experiencing it. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's happening in the body and the brain during burnout through 5 key neurochemicals. And then I'm going to connect it all to the burnout equation. Because once you see the chemistry, once you understand the chemistry, once you understand what's going on in the body and the brain, then the equation makes perfect sense. So let me start with the framework that I use, because this is what underpins everything that I'm about to share. This is the burnout equation, and it looks like this. Toxicity minus sense of self equals burnout. Toxicity minus sense of self equals burnout. Now, toxicity is anything in someone's environment that depletes them, right? It could be chronic stress, psychological unsafety, overwork, moral injury, a culture that demands that they perform a version of themselves that isn't real. It could be their thoughts, their patterns, their behaviors, their habits, people, anything. Could be toxic workplaces. The sense of self is then knowing who you are, who they are, what they value, what they feel, their values, their drivers, their passions. And it's having an environment that actually allows them to access all of that, right? To be themselves. We talk a lot about bringing our whole self to work, but what if we don't fully understand? What if your clients don't fully understand who they are in the first place? Who is that whole self that we keep talking about? Now, when toxicity is high and the sense of self is low, or it has been systematically eroded, you get burnout. Not eventually, but predictably. Toxicity minus sense of self will always lead to burnout. This is what I've seen from 13 years now of doing this work, over 11,000 coaching hours, having coached over 700 leaders through burnout. This equation has been present in every single one. Now, here's what the neurochemistry shows us, right? And again, this isn't a metaphor. That equation is literally playing out in the brain, in the body at a chemical level. So I want to show you how in this video, talking about 5 neurochemicals and how they link to the burnout equation. So firstly, we have cortisol, right? And this is the alarm. If we think about it that way, it's the alarm that won't switch off. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, and it's not a villain. We all need an element of stress. We all need an element of cortisol within our body. It's a survival mechanism. So when you face a genuine threat, cortisol floods your system. It sharpens your focus. It mobilizes your energy and it gets you through it. The problem isn't cortisol. The problem is chronic, high, severe levels of cortisol. Because cortisol evolved to spike and recover. And modern working environments, how many of us are living and working and being, those environments don't allow the cortisol to recover. So when cortisol stays elevated over weeks and months, sometimes years, something important starts to happen. Because it doesn't just affect your stress response, it begins to damage the receptor sites for your other key neurochemicals. It literally, quite literally, degrades the system's ability to actually feel reward, connection, and regulation. And there's something else. Chronic cortisol causes what's called adrenal fatigue, a state where your body is physically exhausted but wired, unable to rest, unable to switch off. And your clients know that feeling. If you've been at burnout, you know that feeling too, right? You're absolutely exhausted. You're shattered, but you can't sleep. You're too tired to function, but you're also too activated to stop. That's cortisol. It's running a threat response in your body, and the body has nowhere to direct it. Secondly, we have adrenaline and norepinephrine. The surge, the actual physical, mental surge within us, that becomes the standard. Adrenaline and its close relative, norepinephrine, are your acute stress chemicals. These are chemicals that are designed for immediacy, right? Danger appears, adrenaline surges, you respond, and then it dissipates. In burnout, particularly in what we call the frenetic type of burnout, where someone is driven, overworking, always chasing, adrenaline becomes the operating system, not the emergency response. So we see it in the person who can't sit still, the one who books a holiday but spends the entire holiday working, the one who confuses the adrenaline state with being productive, being alive, being enough, feeling worthy enough, ready enough, doing enough. The body can sustain this for a while. But unlike cortisol, adrenaline does dissipate rapidly, which means the person needs to keep generating the next urgency, the next crisis, the next deadline, just to feel normal within themselves. So when adrenaline becomes the baseline, stillness feels like failure, connection feels pointless, and reflection feels like a threat. And a person who can't access stillness or reflection cannot access their sense of self. And that's the equation beginning to tip. Thirdly, we have dopamine, the motivator that runs out, right? Dopamine is often called the reward chemical, but that's really an oversimplification. Dopamine is really about anticipation. It's the drive toward something that matters. It's the motivation, it's the meaning, it's the purpose, it's the progress. And in a healthy system, dopamine fires when you do meaningful work, when you connect with someone genuinely, when you make progress towards something that reflects your values. But under chronic stress and prolonged overwork, dopamine levels drop. And this shows up in a very, very specific way in burnout. We see it in the client who used to love their work. They were passionate, curious, and energized. And now they're just numb, flat, going through the motions, turning up every day in what I call robot mode, just showing up, doing the work, going through the motions. But they end up just flat and numb because nothing feels worth it. And it's not weakness, even though we can assume that it is. The person can begin to feel that there's something wrong with them. But what's showing up is a depleted dopamine system. And here's what makes it worse. The high cortisol environment doesn't just deplete dopamine, it shrinks the dopamine sensitivity. And this means even things that should feel rewarding don't. The brain's capacity to register reward has been structurally reduced. So if you've got a client that's constantly achieving, constantly striving, constantly achieving their goals, but they don't feel anything, it's just flatness. No win feels like a win. They're just on to the next thing and on to the next thing and on to the next thing. It could be what you're seeing here. And it's worth pausing on this, letting it settle. Because as a coach, it's important that you feel the weight of this for your clients. This is also why telling a client at burnout to just do more of what you love or to find your passion again can feel almost cruel. Because the neurochemical infrastructure for experiencing that reward has been compromised. So it's not a mindset shift they need, at least not first. It's recovery. It's a feeling of safety. We need to start working with state. Fourthly, we have serotonin. This is the stabilizer, right? The stabilizer that has been systematically stripped. Serotonin is your mood regulator, and this is what governs your emotional stability, your sleep quality, your appetite, your learning, even the capacity to manage difficult things without being overwhelmed by them. Chronic stress, and specifically chronic cortisol, interferes directly with serotonin, doesn't just reduce it. According to the research, it damages the receptor sites, making serotonin less effective even when it's present. And this is why burnout so often co-presents with what can look like depression or irritability, emotional fragility, disproportionate reactions to things, difficulty sleeping, and even the ability, or the inability rather, to regulate. Serotonin is also closely linked to a sense of safety in the body, in the environment, and in the self. So again, when it's depleted, nothing feels stable. Decision making feels impossible. It feels impossible to move forward, to know what you want. And the future can feel threatening rather than optimistic or open or something that clients want to move towards. And here's the connection to the burnout equation that actually I find quite striking. Serotonin isn't just depleted by overwork. It's depleted by environments where you cannot be yourself, where you have to mask or perform or suppress, or even where you have to edit just who you are to survive and get through the day. Toxicity doesn't just exhaust the body, it biochemically erodes the capacity for emotional stability, for self-trust and for regulation. And that is sense of self, your client's sense of self being stripped at a chemical level. Fifthly and finally, we have oxytocin, the chemical that ultimately makes self-knowledge possible. And this is the one I want you as a coach to pay particular attention to, because oxytocin is usually described as the bonding hormone, the one released through touch, through connection, and through trust. That's only half the story. Research published in Frontiers in Human Neuroscience found that oxytocin plays a direct role in modulating self-consciousness, right? Our ability to process information that's relevant to the self. It's our sense of self-ownership, our true capacity to know ourselves, to know who we are at our very core. So oxytocin isn't just about connection to others, it is about connection to self. Now, here's what burnout, and specifically the environment that produces burnout, does to oxytocin. Chronic stress, as we've already established, elevates cortisol. And cortisol directly lowers oxytocin, making genuine bonding harder. Isolation, which overwork and burnout both produce, further downregulates oxytocin receptors over time. Now, when I talk about burnout specifically, there are two signs that I talk about, two of the key signs that I talk about that we can tell if someone is at burnout. Now, again, it's important that as coaches, we are not diagnosing our clients. But one of the really key telltale signs is an addiction to the busyness, an addiction to the work, an addiction to the toxicity. But at the same time, there is a withdrawal from life, a withdrawal from others, a withdrawal from self. This is this oxytocin playing out in real life. Now, again, research shows that chronic social isolation leads to downregulation of oxytocin receptors in the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus. These are the very areas involved in self-regulation and in emotional memory. And again, if you've been at burnout or you see it in your clients, you will know that the memory, the emotional memory, the decision making are all hindered when someone gets to the point of burnout. So what we're looking at in this is an environment high in toxicity, chronic stress, overwork, disconnection, performance demands, systematically reduces the neurochemical that enables self-knowledge. The person who is at burnout is the person who has most lost access to themselves. And that isn't a coincidence. That's chemistry. It's actually happening in the brain, in the body. Oxytocin doesn't just connect us to others, it connects us to ourselves. And burnout at a biological level cuts that off completely. So let's bring this back to the equation. Toxicity minus sense of self equals burnout. Toxicity floods the body with cortisol and adrenaline. It depletes dopamine and serotonin, and it erodes oxytocin. What does that mean for sense of self? Well, when dopamine is depleted, nothing that used to matter matters. When serotonin is disrupted, emotional stability collapses. When oxytocin is suppressed, the neurochemical basis for self-knowledge, for knowing what you feel, what you value, who you are, that is gone. Burnout doesn't just exhaust people, it disconnects them from themselves at a biological level. And that's not just, poetic language. It's not another kind of buzzword statement. That is what the research is telling us. And here's what follows from that, which is why this matters so much for coaches, so much for you as a coach, so much for your clients. The way that most people currently live, being always on, isolated behind screens, performing versions of themselves at work, never in stillness long enough to even hear their own thoughts, let alone process them. This is a neurochemical environment that makes self-knowledge, that makes really understanding themselves, that makes change almost impossible. We have built a world that is high in toxicity and systematically low in the conditions that allow sense of self to exist. So burnout isn't a personal failure, as I keep saying. Burnout is a predictable biological response to an environment that was never designed for human beings like us to thrive in. Which means recovery isn't about pushing through or just thinking differently or just developing more resilience. Recovery requires changing the neurochemical environment. It means reducing the cortisol by reducing the toxicity. It means restoring the dopamine through meaningful engagement. It means rebuilding serotonin through safety and regulation. And crucially, restoring oxytocin through genuine connection and the conditions that allow a person to know themselves again. This is what, as coaches, we need to be focused on. The path back from burnout is the path back to self. And as coaches, understanding the biology of that journey changes everything about how you work. Now, if you're a coach working with clients experiencing burnout, or if you're wondering whether burnout coaching might be the direction that you want to specialize in, I want you to sit with this for a moment. The science tells us that burnout is not a mindset problem. It's a biological event. It's something that plays out in the body, in the brain, in the chemistry of who a person is able to be, how they're able to live their lives, how they're able to show up in the world. And helping someone through it requires much more than just tools and frameworks. It requires understanding about what's actually happening so that you can hold that space with exactly the kind of precision and depth that genuine recovery needs. That's what the Master Burnout Coach program is built on. Not just what burnout is, but what it does at every single level to a person: brain, body, nervous system, sense of self. Now, if this resonates and you want to go deeper, whether that's exploring the MBC, joining the Burnout Coach Collective, or just following along here, I will pop the links below. If you found this video helpful, give it a like, give it a share, hit the bell and subscribe. And if you found this useful, share it with a coach who needs to understand what they're really working with. Because knowing that burnout isn't stress, that's just the beginning.